welcome to the program. This is Vivica Williams, and you're watching Head to Head. Today on the show, we're talking about Mikheil Saakashvili. The former president of Georgia turned Ukrainian opposition leader draws controversy and support for his aggressive stances. He's run afoul of the Ukrainian government and now sits in pretrial detention, accused of aiding criminal groups. Today, we'd like to get a more analytical perspective on this divisive public figure. Joining us in the studio to discuss is Paul Niland. Paul, thank you for being with us today.
Hi, Vivica. It's a pleasure to be back.
So let's jump right in and talk about this current case against Saakashvili.
Okay, but before we do that, let me go back and address one thing from your lead-in. So you called him an opposition leader. I don't believe he's an opposition leader. He's leading right now a very small movement. The party that he represents, that he's been part of forming, polls at something around about 2%. I mean, you know, the top politicians in Ukraine are polling maybe 10%, and that's one of the problems here, is that nobody's got a clear lead, right? Right. But he's significantly lower in terms of public rating than anybody else really that is a name in the political field. But because he is, as you mentioned there, the former president of Georgia, and he was the former governor of the Odessa region, and he's this character, let's call him that.
He is technically an opposition leader of an opposition group. Yeah. Now, not necessarily polling well. Mm-hmm. Right. And so where are the polls coming from? This is the centers that are very trusted, I think, here that've done these polls.
I think so, yeah. I think that Ukraine's polling system in general is quite trustworthy. Right. We tend to get accurate numbers out of these groups, and some are obviously more reliable than others. But, you know, consistently, Saakashvili's grouping is around about 1.6, 1.9%, something like that. And it doesn't really matter what his latest stunt is or whatever, he doesn't seem to be moving up in the general polls. However, the close-knit group that is around him certainly do seem to be passionate in their support. And I mean, when we call him an opposition leader, then to be fair and to go back, I mean, he is a part of a more combined opposition. It's the grouping around him and the way that they've been behaving, and you know, one of the things that Saakashvili and Tymoshenko did together, one of the first things they publicly did together anyway, was to crash the border of Ukraine. Right. So, you know, they started off, and this was a couple of months ago, boarding a train in Poland, and you know, it must be said that the legal basis under which President Poroshenko announced that he was stripping Saakashvili of his Ukrainian citizenship, which had been granted when he came to take the position in Odessa, the legal basis was very, very flimsy. I mean, the argument was that there was a case against Saakashvili in his home country of Georgia, and that hadn't been declared on some forms. But I mean,
it was going back and forth. Both sides are playing this kind of. Right.
Both sides are playing these games. So yeah, it was public knowledge that Saakashvili had this case against him in Georgia. Many believe it to be politically motivated. I think it probably is as well. But you know, when Saakashvili and Tymoshenko then boarded this train in Poland, and then the next thing that was said was the train won't leave the station as long as they're on it, and so them with a crowd of journalists after them, they then got on a bus and they came to the border, and the crowd around Saakashvili forced him across the border. Now, Saakashvili himself has been through a court case on that, and he was fined 3,400 hryvnias. It's like $130 or something like that. It's really a minuscule amount of money. But it wasn't really about the fine. It wasn't really about the money, the amount of the fine. It was more about the direct challenge to the state. You know, you know, one of the most significant symbols of a state are the borders of that state, right? And he directly challenged them with a big middle finger by being dragged across that border and then laughing about it afterwards, you know? And from there on, we've seen an escalation of the tactics. So the next thing that Tymoshenko and Saakashvili did together was to create this protest camp by the Verkhovna Rada, by the Maidan, by the Verkhovna Rada Parliament. Sorry, and you know, my position on that when it started, I went there a few times. In fact, I went there yesterday as well just to take a look around. What I find is incredibly dangerous about the game that is being played, and for them I think it is a game, but it's much more serious than that. A lot of the people by the Parliament building are veterans from the conflict in the east of Ukraine. These are people who have been through significant psychological distress because of their service to their country, and you know, many of them have legitimate grievances as well, right?
And a lot of the people who support, who read these things, they have legitimate grievances.
Yep.
I mean, especially when it comes to issues surrounding corruption and the burdens and with the war and the general feeling for a lot of people of not feeling supported and the government not representing them in some ways. Right? I mean, there's general grievances that people have on many levels.
There are many legitimate grievances, both among the ATO veterans, the war veterans, and the general public as well. I think on Sunday there was there was another march on Sunday that went through Maidan, and MP Sergei Leshchenko said that many of the people who were in that crowd were people of middle class, there were people from Kiev. And there are a lot of people who are dissatisfied with the progress of reforms that we've had, certainly since the last government reshuffle, but in general, you know, since the Maidan. And I think in part as well, a lot of the legitimate grievances are being mixed in with simple fake messaging. So I was part of a story yesterday where somebody was saying that the authorities had given an order to all printers across Kiev to not print anything relating to the march on Sunday, which is, you know, it's a narrative to try and pretend that Poroshenko and co are as authoritarian as Yanukovych was, but that's simply untrue. It just didn't happen, right?
It's true, and it's also hard, and this is in the day and age we have now with news and with facts. It's very hard to get to find the truth in this, because there are some censorship. There is some censorship in media, but is extreme? This is what we're looking at, right? This extreme points of view. Because I do hear this where people say that Poroshenko is just as bad and corrupt, if not worse, than Yanukovych, and as authoritarian. And you have the other side where people say Saakashvili should be the next leader in Ukraine. He comes from the outside. He speaks, honestly and wants to break this corruption. So we have these extreme sides and an extreme rhetoric that's used. I think
there's 3 or 4 questions that were packaged into that. But you know, the one about if we take Saakashvili and he's the honest one, he's the one that wants to deal with corruption, whereas Poroshenko doesn't. If we address that and drill down on that, Saakashvili was asked to go to Georgia, asked to go to Odessa, excuse me,
right.
and Odessa is known to be one of the most corrupt regions in Ukraine, and so he served for a year and a half as the governor of that district, and in the research that I've done, trying to see what achievements he can take from his time down there in Odessa, there's very little. He built some roads. And I see people who are listing out things like, well, you know, there's now a document processing center. We have one of those in Kiev. There's one in Mariupol. That's a national initiative. That's nothing to do with what he did. You know, some beaches became public beaches that had formerly been closed. But I don't really see a big shake-up. And then the next narrative that you get out of the people who are supporting Saakashvili, and it is this, you know, one camp or another.
Right.
The next narrative you get was, well, he was blocked by Kiev. But you're not seeing, or I'm not seeing, and I spend a lot of time researching what happens here in this country, I'm not seeing anything specific to evidence that claim. You know, and then the next thing that you see is, you know, Saakashvili is the only one. He's the only one that can come and save us, right? He's not a messiah. You know, it's absurd to say that he is the only one. There are many people, in actual fact, who could be part of a team of people that can come in and make some changes. And what we shouldn't forget, you know, whereas there is some general dissatisfaction amongst a reasonable group of people, including the middle classes that Leshchenko was talking about that were on Maidan over the weekend, a lot has been done. A lot has been done to address corruption in the years. But the stories that we're seeing now in the international press that are covering the comments that are being made by the Saakashvili grouping, that are covering the complaints that are being made and the issues that they're raising, are again now portraying Ukraine as this place that simply has not yet managed to address corruption or has not yet managed to reform, and that is again so what I would say, like, this is one of the things that Saakashvili is doing that is a great disservice to Ukraine, because
there's been a lot of
progress. There's been a lot. We know there's been a lot, and we know that things are not perfect, and we know that there are people, in power who are not acting as public servants or as civil servants. They're acting in their own personal interests. But if you take, for example, and what I just said about the end of Saakashvili's tenure in Odessa, if you take, for example, when the former Trade and Economy Minister, Aivaras Abramovičius, resigned from his post, he named names. He stood up and he said, this is the kind of examples of corrupt practices and pressure that I've been subjected to. And Saakashvili didn't do any of that. And when he came, as a person with a record for reform in Georgia, I welcomed him coming onto the political scene here, and I thought, okay, great, he's going to crack it.
Right.
Especially in Odessa, right? I mean, he would have so much to work with in Odessa. But really, did he achieve anything? And if we go back to the road building question, in his period there, Saakashvili spent $1 billion on new roads around the oblast, right? My sources in Odessa tell me that the companies, the road building companies in Odessa that are the largest and have the most equipment and capability to perform such contracts are linked to the family of the mayor, Trukhanov, down there. Now, if that's true, Trukhanov was supposed to be Saakashvili's sworn enemy, and he is the person that's supposed to be, I believe he has a Russian citizenship, and he also has many accusations against him in very different ways. But if his family are the ones that are doing the road building, and Saakashvili spent $1 billion on roads,
right. Well, we're seeing it's a lot of things that are similar in even we say the United States, with this blustering, this presenting of giving a cleaner face and showing or saying that a lot more has been done than actually has been done, using this really strong rhetoric. Now, if we come back, we're speaking about what Kyiv, with these veterans and people who have legitimate grievances, and what you're seeing, and I think you were going to talk about here. You have people who have legitimate grievances, and you have other people coming in, as you were saying, with Saakashvili, with this type of speech they're using.
And so they're adding on top of, or they're exploiting, actually, is what I would say, specifically with regards to the veterans, and they are guys and ladies who deserve our utmost respect. They've put their lives on the line, on the front line. And for them to be exploited in the way that they are being exploited, in such a potentially dangerous, potentially lethal way, it is, to my mind, it's something that is simply unforgivable. But when we take the middle classes, and I looked today, I checked the figures, and Saakashvili on his Facebook page, which is apparently where this announcement came of all the printing companies being ordered to not print anything for this march that happened over the weekend, which is just untrue. Saakashvili has 1 million followers on his Facebook page.
Right, this is what someone said to me as well.
That's a lot of people who are being influenced by, there are enough grounds for people to want to protest against things that are happening amongst the authorities. There are attacks against the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. There are events going on inside Parliament with the head of the Anti-Corruption Committee being replaced. They are genuine things that civil society needs to stand against and to make a lot of noise against. But these things are being lost in the noise of what's happening with Saakashvili today. And one of the things, when they tried to arrest him for the first time, which was on Tuesday of last week, when they tried to arrest him, his supporters surrounded the vehicle that he was in, and then they started ripping up the paving stones, and then they broke him out of the vehicle as well. And one of the narratives that I see coming from this Saakashvili supporting camp is that he was being kidnapped. You're not being kidnapped. If the law enforcement authorities of a country have reason to believe that you may be engaged in practice that requires investigation, that's not a kidnapping. But they're calling it a kidnapping, and they're thinking that they're breaking out some kind of freedom fighter, whereas in actual fact, this is a bunch of people saying, we need rule of law, who are breaking the law in a very, very public way at the same time. That's why it's absurd.
Exactly. And I agree with this. I had a discussion with someone with this narrative you're talking about, where this idea of, my thing was, this is, if he has a legitimate grievance, if he's saying this legitimately absurd charges, then you go through the system and prove this. Yep. Versus this idea that we can't trust the system, the selling that the judicial system is corrupt and cannot be trusted to make true change. So here we're seeing people, as you're saying, encouraging the subjugation of rule of law because they want to create rule of law.
Okay, and the obvious argument is that two wrongs don't make a right. But I actually, in the wake of the last anniversary of the end of the Orange Revolution, I wrote an article about the requirement to completely reform the judiciary here. And I'd asked a friend of mine to get me some numbers, and there are something like 7,621 judges sitting in Ukraine right now. If 5% of them can be relied on to deliver an honest decision on something, or deliver an opinion that's not financially motivated or the result of political interference, I'd be surprised if it was any more than 5%. Right. I've heard lawyers argue that maybe 10%, 15% are honest. But yeah, no, there is very seriously a problem with the rule of law here. And I believe, as we did with the patrol police, that particular segment needs a complete and utter reset. And there's no irony lost on the fact as well that the court where Saakashvili has appeared today is the same one where Tymoshenko was sent down. And I'm no Tymoshenko fan, certainly, but when Tymoshenko was in prison for what was clearly a politically motivated case, politically motivated charges, I spoke out at every opportunity that I could, and I said, this is wrong. Selective prosecutions like this are very obviously wrong. But I don't believe in the case of Saakashvili we're simply looking at a politically motivated thing. The charges against him presently, and I've heard the tapes, and I guess you've heard the tapes as well, Saakashvili has been in conversations with figures who are now resident in Moscow. And the immediate assumption that some people have jumped to is it's ridiculous to think that Saakashvili, who's fought against Putin so long, would be in bed with the Russians. Right. The person actually that Saakashvili is alleged to have been speaking to is a guy called Sergei Kurchenko. And Kurchenko rose during the Yanukovych presidency essentially as Yanukovych's bagman. Starting from the age of 26 or 27, by the time he was 28 years old, the man was a billionaire already. And he was in that first wave of people on the 22nd of February of 2014 who fled to Moscow to seek exile, from at the end of the revolution, along with Azarov and Ivan Yushchenko and all the most corrupt of the people of the Yanukovych era. They all ran, including Kurchenko, and that is who it is alleged that Saakashvili was speaking to. Now, I don't know Kurchenko's voice. I've never spoken to the man, but I know Saakashvili's voice, and I know what Saakashvili was saying on his side of the conversation. It requires investigation and hopefully an honest court decision from hopefully an honest judge. So
let's take a second. We're going to take a second and see a little bit of that film from here. Let's look a little bit of the video.
And my friend told me that he, so to say, spoke to you and he was very satisfied and grateful.
Okay, look, fundamentally speaking, what I wanted to discuss, I have business interests in Ukraine, I have financial means, and I have access to different offices in Russia, and I'm interested in building a long history with you. Is this course of events possible?
I think I just need to talk to our friends about that. Actually, that's a separate issue, and we need to talk about that, discuss it.
Okay, so then talk a bit about, for me, what are some of the things that he's saying here, and how serious are they?
Saakashvili is being asked whether he has trusted people within his circle of friends and advisors who would go to Moscow to have conversations about how those individuals, be it Kurchenko or whoever else it might have been on the phone, to go to Moscow and have conversations with those individuals about accepting assistance from them. They're saying, I have business interests there in Ukraine that can help to finance your political activity. They're saying, we have sufficient contacts here in Moscow that we can open doors of any kind of office to any kind of people. And you know, again, that is certainly Saakashvili's voice, without doubt. And the very fact that he's having a conversation with whomever it might be there in Moscow goes to show, I mean, you know, there's the expression, right? Your enemy's enemy is not necessarily your friend, right? Right. And whereas Saakashvili may have been led into thinking, you know, here's someone that wants to help finance this thing that they're trying to get started, you should really be looking at, if those individuals are based in Moscow, what is their ulterior motive? And I think that is the process of investigation that is going to come now in the next couple of months. The accusations are very, very serious, and the bottom line is it requires investigation. Mm-hmm. But the issue that is in everyone's mind is how accurate, how true will this investigation be? Will it be arbitrary? Will it be politically motivated? I think this is what a lot of people are concerned about. So it's not the case of should this investigation be done, it's how will it be carried out, and concerns about the judicial system's ability to be impartial. And considering where we are and considering the record of Ukraine's courts, that's a genuine fear, and it would be normal to do that. But again, what we have here that's very, very strong, whether we go back to what I was saying about the pressure that needs to come from civil society about the actions against Nabu and the head of the anti-corruption committee inside of Parliament, right? What we have here is a very strong civil society. We have an educated populace who are very determined that the last revolution that we went through will be the last revolution because of the horrors that were experienced during that period, not just the way that it ended, but the times of Khrushchevska Street as well, and the deaths that happened there back in January. And when people are talking, you know, it's sometimes with glee about another Maidan, like, I'm sorry, but you people don't remember what the last one was like, right? But we have civil society who have that memory, and they are the ones who have been since the end of the revolution and will continue to be through the continuing evolution of Ukrainian politics. They're the ones that will keep a check and a balance on those that are in power, on those authorities, be it a judge or be it the president or be it the prime minister or whoever it might be. And I heard the same initially when these tapes were released on the first day that they tried to arrest Saakashvili on the Tuesday. You know, somebody straight out came straight out and said, well, I believe that they're fake. Well, I don't know what you're basing that belief on, but if you look at this rationally and logically, why on earth would Lutsenko and Poroshenko take such a risk to create such a fake? That would be incredibly stupid of them to simply doctor up something of that magnitude in a case that is going to attract such high-profile attention. You would think that if they come out with this tape and said, listen to what is going on here, you would think that you're going to have to give them the benefit of the doubt. And again, you know, we hope that a court ruling will be based on the facts of the matter and on nothing else. But in a case of a trial against the former president of a country, You've got to get your ducks in a row. You've got to get things lined up well before you go into that, right? And I just don't think that they'd be that stupid. They don't need to be for a man who's polling at 2%.
Well, we're going to have to see how this comes out. Thank you so much for being with us today, Paul.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you. Today we spoke with Paul Niland, a political commentator here in Kyiv. Thank you for joining us.